we will start here because I know one class did not get to this point. Those of you guys who are already past this, y'all can go ahead and fast forward just a little bit, and I'll let you guys can kind of start there. So, okay, behavioral properties of muscles. We didn't really get to these in the beginning, but our muscles basically have 4 behavioral properties, okay? Extensibility, which is its ability to stretch, to be stretched, okay? We know that that can happen with muscle, okay? It happens anytime you pick up something that stretches, something that's pulled at least by weight. Like, for me, example, if I'm going to pick up a 50-pound bag of corn, okay, it's going to stretch my muscles. Elasticity is our muscles' ability to like snap back or to just to return back to normal, and that's important because they need to be able to do that. Now that can be changed, like I said yesterday. The elasticity can be stretched and lengthened, our muscle, if you will, so that it doesn't snap back automatically. That just comes over time. Irritability is its ability to respond to a stimulus. So kind of like neurons, our muscles have the ability to be stimulated by a neuron so that they can contract. I mean, that's how they work. Every muscle has a neuron connected to it, and that's what tells it to contract and shorten. And then last is contractility, and this is a muscle's ability to shorten or to condense, Now, all of these, there's other cells in our bodies that can do all of these, like stretch, like the extensibility and the elasticity. I mean, we have connective tissue that does that, right? Cartilage is one example. Irritability, we know that our neurons do that. But contractility, this is something that is unique specifically to muscle cells, muscle tissue. Okay, and that's its ability to snap or to shorten. One word to add in here under contractility is tensile force or tension. So this is the pulling force of muscle on the bone, and the amount of tension force is always constant. But we have 2 terms here, an agonist and an antagonist. Muscles always work in pairs. So the agonist is the muscle that's actually working to pull the bone or move the bone. So if you think about it, I've got my bicep, okay? If I move my arm in here, my bicep, okay, that is the agonist. It's actually doing the moving. Triceps back here is the antagonist. It's opposing that movement. There's enough tension there that it's actually kind of like it's pulling it in opposition. Okay. Tension. Okay, the word contraction. Go back to here for a second. Just means that tension has developed in a muscle, so it's pulling, it's getting tense, etc. Okay. Now, this can actually happen in 3 ways. The first one is called concentric contraction. Okay, so what I want everybody to do is I want you to just take your arm and just lift it up. I hope you guys can see my video here. Okay, so take your arm, lift it up. Okay, this is concentric contraction. My bicep is contracting, my antagonist, the triceps back here, is relaxing, okay? And what actually happens is the muscle shortens, okay? That's the intention of that, of it contracting, okay? That's concentric, moving that direction. Okay, let's look at eccentric contraction for just a minute. Okay, here's what I want you guys to do. Okay, I want everybody to take your anatomy book, hold it in your hand. Okay, we're gonna do this with our biceps. So let's do concentric first. We'll go back and do concentric. Move your bicep up. Move your book up to your shoulder. Okay, you can tell when you're moving it up. Your biceps contracted. Your triceps, they may be contracted a little bit too. But once you move it up here, okay? It's contracted, okay? They're kind of working opposites. Now, when you lower your book back down, notice your bicep is still contracting, right? Your bicep's still contracting, okay? But it's actually getting longer. Like you're still using your bicep to move this book down, but it's not actually shortening, okay? That's what it's talking about with eccentric motion, okay? So that's eccentric. And then last, we have isometric. And iso, whenever you see that word, it means the same, okay? So what this means is that actually both of them contract, okay, the agonist and the antagonist, and there's no movement. And that's important for you guys to know. Whenever you hear of isometric, there's no change. There's no movement, okay? So isometric is like if I'm holding this book still right here, so everybody kind of holds your book right in place, okay? Both are contracted because it's like it's right in the middle. So it's using both muscles. That's isometric. It's not moving, but my muscles are still contracting. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense for you guys. Go back to my list here. Okay, you guys can take just a moment to do this. And then we'll keep going. So you can pause for a second if you want to go over that. Okay, 5.2. So let's go ahead and get moving on to lesson 5.2, the muscle actions. This would be a really, really good section, just this section. I mean, you can read, I want you to read all of it, but for sure this section, after we talk about it today, I really want you guys to go home and read the section in your book. I think that would be really helpful for you guys because there's some details in here that I think you might miss otherwise, or you might not understand later on. And if you'll go ahead and read it now while we've talked about it today, while it's still on your mind, you may understand it a little better. Okay, so page 162 is where we are. Okay, so the skeletal muscle, which is primarily what we're going to talk about from here on out. Now we talked about smooth and cardiac a little bit, but from here on out we're pretty much just going to talk about skeletal. It contains what's called a motor unit. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about different types, and then we're going to talk about strength, power, and endurance a little bit. We're not going to get into any great detail there. Okay, so the motor unit. Okay, motor unit is a group of muscle fibers that's under the control of one motor neuron. Okay, first of all, when we hear the word motor, and you guys might write this down, anytime you hear that word motor, think movement. Okay, motor moves, motor moves. Okay, and we'll hear the word neuromuscular, and all that's talking about is how the nerves connect to the muscles to tell them what to do. Okay, so the motor unit is actually the functional unit of the neuromuscular system. One motor neuron can actually connect to anywhere from 100 to like 2,000 muscle fibers. So we're not just talking about, it's not like you have a nerve or a neuron for every single muscle fiber. Like one neuron can affect multiple muscle fibers, thousands. Okay, typically things that you use with your finer movements, you have less fibers per unit. So one example it gave.
Dakota Chancellor, come to the office. Dakota Chancellor, come to the office.
It talked about the eyes and the fingers, like these finer motor movements, motor skills, finer motor skills. There we go. Those typically you have less neurons that attach to muscle, or less fibers attached to one neuron than in your quads, for example, like your vastus lateralis and your glutes, where you would have one motor neuron can reach many muscle fibers. So anyways, interesting. Okay, so going over to page 163, and I want you guys to look at this picture at the top of page 163, this picture that's on the board right now. Couple things I want you guys to notice. One, you've seen a picture that looks similar to this before, and that is in the very beginning of the year when we talked about feedback. Now this only has one end of that whole mechanism. This only has the motor part, so that's all we're looking at right now. Next chapter we'll get into the rest of those details. Okay, but what I want you to notice right here, okay, so like this blue one here, here's the cell body is in the spinal cord. This is supposed to be the spinal cord. This is like a little section of it. And look, motor unit A, it comes out and it splits and it goes to all these different muscle fibers. Same thing here, motor unit B goes to other muscle fibers. Okay. Now keep in mind, this is actually just one cell. This neuron right here, the cell body is here, and this axon, which is what carries the action potential or the nerve impulse, goes all the way to the muscle. It's the same cell though. Okay. Pretty interesting, I think. Okay, so let's look at 163, and let's read this. I want you guys to read this section about generating action potentials. There's lots of vocabulary in here, so pay attention to that. You might even want to write a little bit of it down if you want. It's in your like your chapter packet too. So you may just want to circle it there or something. Okay, it says, how does the motor neuron communicate with the muscle cells in the motor unit to stimulate them? As figure 5.5 shows, a long, thin fiber called an axon connects the motor neuron cell body with the muscle fibers included in the motor unit. Okay, so that's what it's talking about. Close to the fibers, the axon branches, the axon branches into axon terminals, which are, if you look really close right here, okay, these axons kind of branch out into other smaller branches, and those are the axon terminals, and that's what it's talking about. It says, which in turn branch out to individual muscle fibers. So these split, and each one of these are going to go to its own muscle fiber. Okay, the link between each axon terminal and muscle fiber is called the neuromuscular junction. Okay, so let's think about that. It makes sense. Neuro, neuron, musculo, muscle. So that's the junction between the nerve, the neuron, and the muscle fiber. Okay, so all it's talking about is right where these attach, these axon terminals attach to this muscle fiber, there's a little bitty space in there between the neuron and the muscle fiber, and that whole little connecting point is the junction. That space, or that little bitty gap, is known as the synaptic cleft, or sometimes it'll say synaptic gap, or even sometimes it's just called the synapse. So whenever you see that word synapse or synaptic, that's what it's talking about, is that little bitty space between the neuron and the muscle fiber. And we're talking, I mean, I can't even like make the space with my fingers. I don't even know. So it says when a nerve impulse reaches the end of an axon terminal, and we're talking about a nerve impulse, we're just talking about the electrical message that goes from the brain or the spinal cord, that electrical message that is sent down the neuron to the muscle to make it contract. Okay, it says when a nerve impulse reaches the end of the axon terminal, so the end of that neuron, a chemical called a neurotransmitter discharges and diffuses across the cleft to attach to the receptors on the muscle fiber. Look over on page 164. Oh no, I don't have this picture. Sorry. Okay, look at page 164. That's what I want you to look at. Okay, so this big yellow thing on page 164 is your axon terminal. Okay, just this end here. And you can see the muscle fiber, kind of that pink is like the sarcolemma, the lining around it. And look at this. There's a little bitty space in between the neuron and the muscle fiber. They don't actually touch. Okay, and these neurotransmitters, they kind of look like pills on here. Okay, and when we're talking about muscles, the neurotransmitter that's used, it's a chemical, it's kind of like a hormone, chemical, and it delivers the message from the neuron and tells the muscle to contract. Okay, it's called acetylcholine, and that is important for you to know. So you need to make sure you know that acetylcholine is the transmitter, the neurotransmitter. We're talking about muscles. And it just disperses across that little gap into the muscle. Okay. Back to 163, it says the effect of acetylcholine is to make the sarcolemma temporarily permeable. Channels open that allow positive sodium ions to rapidly invade the fiber at the same time that positive potassium ions rush out of the fiber. So remember we talked about the sodium-potassium pump, okay? So one of the things that this acetylcholine does is it changes, it causes the plasma membrane or the sarcolemma to become permeable to make those pumps kind of turn on. It changes it so that they will work. And it pulls all these sodium ions into the muscle cell. And it actually pushes out some of the potassium ions. But it doesn't happen at the same rate. And so we get this overwhelmingly positive charge inside the muscle, okay, because of how that's working out. So Chris, shout out to Chris, you were talking about the frog legs and the salt thing. I've never heard of that before in my life, but it really makes sense when you think about, you're talking about frog legs, and think about those being muscle, and what makes our muscles contract is an influx of sodium. Okay, so if you've got an influx of sodium into the muscle, and you think about those frog leg muscles and you pour salt on them, it makes sense, especially because once things die, remember our cells become permeable to lots of things. So those muscle cells, if they're dead at least, they wouldn't necessarily need, they wouldn't necessarily need all those pumps to work. They'd just take it all in. Anyway, so interesting. I have no idea if that's really the cause, but it makes sense. So, or at least it makes sense to me. Says this reversal of electrical charge is known as depolarization. That's what that whole effect is caused. So when that sodium rushes in, it causes this upheaval kind of the charge inside that muscle cell, kind of like zips it out and it becomes positive. That's called depolarization. And it's going to travel all the way down that muscle fiber so that it can contract. Okay, it says depolarization triggers the opening of additional channels in the fiber that allow only the entry of additional sodium. This flood of positive ions into the fiber generates an electrical charge called an action potential. Now, here's the other thing I want you guys to think about. We talk about dehydration. We've talked about it before, but you think about when you're exercising, you're at a higher risk to get dehydrated. Well, this makes sense. Why? Because your muscles are constantly using up that sodium, potassium, all of your electrolytes, anything that carries that charge, So your body's constantly using it up. That's why you have to replenish with not just water, but with electrolytes too. So pretty cool, makes sense. Says this flood of positive ions into the fiber generates an electrical charge called an action potential. Pretty interesting, I think. It's pretty cool. Okay. Okay, look over at this next one. Oops. Okay, contraction of the sarcomeres. Okay, so here's what I want you to look at. Page 163 still. Sorry, I got hung up looking at something. And we'll just keep on reading this section because I think it explains it better than I could. Okay, so at the bottom, contractions of the sarcomeres. Glucose stored in the form of glycogen within the muscle. I'll raise this up so you guys can see it a little bit better. I lost my spot. Glucose stored in the form of glycogen, we've talked about that before, within the muscle cell provides the energy for creating the action potential. Phosphocreatine within the cell enables the transfer of energy to the protein filaments, actin and myosin. So these actin and myosin are protein filaments within each muscle fiber. Okay, these are not cells on their own. These are inside the cell. Actin and myosin are contractile proteins that reside in functional units called sarcomeres. So within the cell, we have sarcomeres, and within that sarcomere, it's kind of the unit, the contracting unit within the muscle fiber. It says the release of calcium ions triggers the sliding of the actin filaments over the myosin filaments, resulting in a contraction of the sarcomere. So what it's talking about, look, is these actin filaments, whenever these start to contract, they actually pull together. These little heads on here kind of like reach up and pull that in, and that's what actually shortens, okay, that's what actually shortens each sarcomere, each little functional unit within the muscle fiber itself. So this is taking place even deeper than this. I mean, this is at the cellular level, inside the cell. This is what's happening. It says, what causes the actin filaments to slide over the myosin filaments? Notice that the myosin filaments are encircled by small protrusions called heads. When the sarcomere is activated by an action potential, these heads attach to the receptor sites on the actin filaments, forming cross bridges. So it's talking about between here, these little heads on this myosin form bridges, little cross bridges with these actin filaments here. As these cross bridges contract, pulling the actin filaments toward the center of the sarcomere. During the process of sarcomere contraction, these cross bridges attach, pull, and release multiple times. So it's just like kind of like it's clawing at it, if you will. The calcium ions released with the arrival of the action potential enable the attachments of the myosin heads to enable the attachments of the myosin heads to the actin filaments. Thus, the neuromuscular system has the ability to produce slow, gentle movements as well as fast, forceful ones. The ability to produce different kinds of movements and force variance is accomplished by regulating the number and frequency of action potentials. So a lot of that just determines on how well that message or how many times that message is sent. Only a small number of action potentials are needed for slow, gentle movements, while fast or forceful ones require a large number of action potentials. Those are the nerve impulses. So anyway, it's pretty, I think it's just really interesting. One other thing, it doesn't really talk about in here that I've seen, at least so far. The thing that gives muscles their striations is actually the sarcomeres. So let me see if I can actually maybe show you guys. If you get our old textbook out, let's stop